Welcome back to another great conversation at Table Talk TV. Hopefully you guys have been enjoying the episodes. We've been enjoying having these conversations. Hopefully it's edifying to you guys. But today, conversation number 8, we're going to be talking about, does Christ and culture mix? Since the times of Christ, the culture and societal norms, they've changed as anything would. But a lot of the people in the church, they want to know, especially in today's day with a lot of cultural relativity, is the church supposed to be relative? Is there a line between traditions and modernization? And does adaptation mean compromising biblical truths? Today we're going to be talking about church, culture, and Christ. Stay tuned. Hopefully you guys were thinking about what we were talking about in the intro. If you go to more traditional churches, they're going to really push down some type of cliche narrative. Like, maybe you need to dress in suit and ties, or maybe you need to clean your room. Shout out to Jordan Peterson.
Well, I find the irony of it all is, the more traditional churches, the more dress code and garb that they wear, the more loose they are in their theology.
Yeah, there's probably some correlation there with that. But that's a deeper question. Is that what the church's supposed to do? Like, when you think about it throughout church history, was it always like that? Or was there like this standard? And, we're not talking about monasticism where we're trying to go be monks or something.
Right now I'm thinking of the Episcopus.
Yeah.
And it's not natural. It was never like that before.
Well, before we get into other things, we'll break down some scripture and some ideas about it. What do you guys think on the simple level? When you go into the church, a lot of times there's these cliche things. You go in there, everybody's mingling, and then it's time to make announcements, and then you have this feeling like, oh, I got to get ready. So you put on this persona. It's like, oh, I got to be reverent. I got to be serious. It's time to worship God. And then, pastor, associate pastor go up there, give some announcements, and then get into worship. And, there's like this regiment. But there's like, is that real? Is that a persona?
It's very real.
Yeah, or is it supposed to be like other churches where they put on light shows and it's like having a concert and they're really modernized? Is that what the church is supposed to be like? Is that cultural relativity something that the church is supposed to strive for, or are they supposed to be more traditional?
Well, Kuyper's theory of relativity has always been in question. How much of the church should we mix with state? But what you're talking about is how much culture we should mix with the church. Well, church and culture.
Yeah, because state is more or less, it's not so much
the governing powers.
Yeah, it's society precedes governmental polity. Whatever you're, like, if you go to an indigenous tribe, they have a governance too. But it's not a westernized governance. But society preceded that governance. It's actually a byproduct of their society. And so whenever they have their governance, these indigenous tribes, their culture is embedded into that type of governance. So yeah, Kuyper and his interesting postmillennialism, it's probably because of the culture that was enforcing that church culture, his surrounding type of Presbytery culture. Forced that.
And there's no doubt also he's just projecting. He himself was a politician. I believe he was a senator, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to look at it again, but he was a man with authority. He could tell a soldier to go and he goes. He can tell him to come and he comes. And that's what he imputed into his theological paradigms. If you guys look at his pro-rages. But you're talking specifically, should culture and church be combined? And I don't know if you can really separate them completely any more than you can separate church and state, but you can at least do a pretty good job to keep culture separately. Like, should we be listening to, WAP in the church And I'm not saying that in a baby accent. I'm not saying rap. I'm saying WAP.
Well, what becomes something correlated with that is that's one layer because, yeah, you can't isolate because, these sanctificational functions or these external polities are byproducts of your society. So if your society listens to certain type of music, then clearly that's what you're raised in. But more or less, like if you go to an older church, they're going to place this certain standard on people who come to their church. And then they propagate that this standard has to be followed. And if not, there's a judgment placed, which is because they're thinking you're not presenting this attitude or function of Christ. But that is a judgment not on you because you're just a byproduct of your society, right? But they are saying, well, in church, we're supposed to be like this. So that's why this question arises, which is there a real separation between your culture and the church? Because there's an illusion that it is. Any church that you go to that's more even if you go to a more liberal church, then they push the other narrative, which is the same thing. It's like Poplar's paradox of tolerance. So they'll say you need to be extremely relative, and then they judge the traditional. So either way, there's this dichotomy that's clear. But is that how it's supposed to be? Because is there a fakeness now? Are these people who are very liberal faking the idea of God's reverence? And are these people who are very traditional faking the idea that when they leave church, they're very relative? And is there supposed to be a separation, or is there not? Because
I know secular people call those kind of Christians in churches hypocrites. You act one way on Sunday and you act a different way on Monday.
Yeah, and so what happens when this becomes a normative? Because every church will do it in some sense. Because even the more liberal churches who try to say, well, I act like this all the time, they're still trying to propagate, I really worship God. I really have a reverence for God. I really love God. But then when the more traditional people look at them, they say, where's the reverence? Where's the worship? Where's the realness? And that's why they'll say, well, we don't see it. We just see you being relative.
Well, that's why our worship leader is still traditional, and it's always going to stay that way.
They said it couldn't be done.
Is this the same guy from last week?
Just too strong. They said you don't have a chance.
Man, we need to push out an offering plate for him.
They don't understand.
Give him some.
Armies rise, battles rage. They're gonna bow at the sound of one name. When we praise, they all fall. Our victory's in the Almighty God.
But this is a good example, though, is that this guy's mentality has a certain type of reverence that he believes he's pushing out what he believes God wants him to. And, very much it may be true. Who am I to say anything?
And that's why we hired him on.
Sure, you pay him well. But on the larger sense, if I put on some popular worship leader that has like this $1 million studio production, it has this illusion that's because it's more sensational. It has this illusion that that's more real and legitimate. And that's a whole nother layer of this assessment is because of production. This guy you just showed,
Stephen.
Yes, that man. He's probably seen as a joke. Yet if I put on some, famous worship leader, they're seen as legitimate. And that itself is an assessment or judgment of cultural relativeness.
I see stuff like elevation worship as a joke.
Okay.
Please don't sue me, Stephen Furtick.
So what do we tell to the church when they ask these things? Because, you depending on what kind of church you go to, this thing is going to flip all over the place. Who's right?
Yeah, I guess there's just a lot to unpack, especially like with this type of question. Like you can really take it in a lot of directions. I think growing up in a Pentecostal denomination, you hear one side of like free will, all this stuff, Arminianism, speaking in tongues, everything else. And then they're like, oh, just don't talk to the Baptists because they're Calvinists and they don't believe in, they're cessationalists and everything else, and they don't whatever. But you go to the Baptist side, and then they're like, oh, Pentecostals are just weird. They think that blah, blah, blah. They're continuous, which doesn't exist. And then there's just a lot of, I think, bickering back and forth on these things instead of actually being able to sit down, realizing like these are also brothers and sisters in Christ, like no matter what. And I need to keep an open mind and be able to have those types of conversations, even if I'm not excited to have it, but being able to be like, well, this person could say something and maybe completely change my whole theology on how I read this because I was reading this wrong, or maybe I was able to help them like realize like this was the type of thing that they needed to hear. So I just think, I don't know, there needs to be like a come to a means on a type of thing instead of just saying, oh, but stay away from this, because we don't want to teeter with that. Like if we're called to go and make disciples, like that is what your main job as a Christian is called to do. Like that's what Jesus said in Matthew 28. That's what we are called to do. And then I think, I don't even remember where it says, but it says to be sheep among wolves. Like what does that mean to actually like send out people? Although sure, we have different theological stances. Like what does it look like to be a sheep among wolves? So,
well, on a deeper level, that's true. One layer is doctrine, but on a more simpler level, what about people believing that it's okay to bring this type of lifestyle into the church? Like I've been to places before where they'll bring secular music into the church. They'll play a football game in the church. They'll do all kinds of stuff.
Like they'll change their topics into like a movie preaching series. Yeah.
Yeah. And when they do that, that's a form of cultural relativity. They're trying to embrace the culture into the church. Do you think that's something that should be there? Or do you believe it should be separate? And if you do believe it's separate, is that a form of some type of hypocrisy?
I think there's a very thin line. Like you look at what Paul says in Romans 12:2, where he says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but let God transform you by the renewing of your mind. Like, so that's one. I guess a question for you guys is like, what does it mean to conform versus dwell in? I guess. I don't know.
You know, the old pastors, what they always say, it's not just you come
for propagation.
Proclamation for propagation.
That's what I say. I never claimed to be a pastor. What they, what the old pastors say is, you just don't come to church and be a Christian on Sunday. You're supposed to be a Christian Monday through Saturday too. And does that mean that your life is supposed to look like what it's on Sunday? Is there a discontinuity? Because a lot of times that's what it is. In reality, people come to church and have a certain persona. But then when they leave church, it's
like the face comes off.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. I went to a church one time, and the pastor, and I've been to many churches that did the same thing. The pastor basically just brags about himself, and nobody somehow seems to notice that the pastor's doing that in the audience. Like nobody sees it. They're like, "Oh yeah, amen, pastor," and then they all want to be like him. And I struggled with that a lot. I didn't realize that's what was happening until I went to a more consistent sounding church where the pastor actually directed everybody's attention to God and not himself. Then I went back to one of those churches I used to go to, and it just, that's when my eyes were open to it. But aside from all that, what's interesting is I asked that pastor and his associate pastor some questions afterward, and he said that there's churches that have he said there's two different dynamics. You can be outward focused or inward focused. So that explained a lot. So yeah, if you're a more outward focused church, you're not going to go too deep into the Bible. You're going to be playing, all the stuff that the world plays. You're going to draw people in, and that's the whole point. You're just drawing people in. You're not actually going into the Bible. You're just trying to plant seeds. So I guess it's a way of evangelizing. The pastor is just some kind of evangelist, I guess. And you're drawing all the people in to plant seeds in them. Whereas the other dynamic, a more inward-focused church, is not focused on outreach so much. They're more focused on planting, watering the seeds that are there, and having like a nursery of trees. So I think that explains a lot, and it has to do with a lot of what we're talking about.
What's
Two
complicated
dynamics.
about that, though, is what you say is true, but is that a church? That's the hard part. Because, I doing a lot of evangelism throughout the years, there's they separate these two things. There's evangelistic ministry, and, you might have a whole different area. Like we had this big gymnasium where it would be a funnel, where it would be a place where we could be more culturally sensitive, play basketball, do things, but it wasn't considered the church. It was more like a funnel, an outreach program. Clearly, that's what it was called, the Recreation Outreach Center, the ROC.
The funnel.
Yeah. But church itself was separate because, when you go through the Bible, the church was specifically for believers. It wasn't a recruitment area. People would go out to recruit, and then the idea is you'd bring them in so they can actually learn about God, because that's what they wanted, is a place of worship.
What's interesting is, to your point in Acts 2, because I hear them right now in my ear. You can, if you listen closely, you can hear them too, saying, this is what Acts 2 is all about. Yeah. Peter preached the gospel to thousands, and then 3,000 were added to them that day. What's interesting, though, is this isn't called a church service in Acts 2. And on the contrary, they preached the gospel outside of the church setting, outside of where they were meeting, and then 3,000 people were added to something. So the 3,000 people weren't added to the church, and then Peter preached this gospel message. Peter preached the gospel message, and then they repented, and then they were added to the church. So now they're in the church after Peter preached the gospel to thousands of people. And not all of them believed either, obviously, but 3,000 of them were added to something that day. As that's a big word people don't like either, is membership too. We'll have, memberships of all kinds of things, subscriptions of Netflix, but we don't want to be a member of a church, unfortunately, these days. It sounds too patriarchal or matriarchal or whatever. But anyway, they have arguments for their side too, though. Both dynamic churches throw stones at each other. One says you don't outreach enough to the inward focused churches. And then the inward focused churches tell the outward focused churches, you don't feed the people that you have enough. And I don't know why it seems like it always has to happen. You can't find a church that does both. You can never, the churches that are more inward focused, the people are very theologically astute. They're not outreaching for some weird reason. And if they are, it's like one congregation member, and the church is never going to back anything like that because they're more inward focused. So you really just got to pick your medicine.
Yeah, but the problem becomes, all that's real. When people go to church, they feel that. The problem becomes, what is really this whole thing called Christianity in the sense of the world we live in? Like, of course, we go to church. That's one thing. But I assume most Christians would believe that your Christianity doesn't end at the church. Your relationship with Christ doesn't end there. When Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, I assume people believe that means there's something that you are replicating even outside of the church, because Paul was outside of the church all the time. But there was something he was telling all of them, follow me as I follow Christ. What is that? Was it that he was being culturally relative all the time? And sometimes he was. He clearly says, when I'm in Rome, be as the Romans.
No, that guy was letting it whip.
Yeah, he would.
He got 40 lashes and saved one.
This reminds me of the first real issue in the church. It's what they would coin as the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. We'll read through it, but it's interesting because, when you think about the first century church, they're all just a bunch of Jewish practicing individuals. This is all they knew. They're a bunch of Israelites. And when the gospel starts manifesting to people outside of their cultural normality, what do they deal with? They deal with all these people who are bringing outside ideas into their lifestyle. It wasn't just the church. It was their lifestyle. They had things like, well, should I be circumcised or uncircumcised? To us, that sounds like, who cares? But to them, the Israelites, this was a covenantal issue. And now these other people says, why do I have to do that? Or, their idea of what they would eat or the festivals they would have, the things that we do. To be the example of, maybe we go to a movie or maybe we go to certain gatherings. And then the Israelite people would have said, well, I don't know if that's godly. I don't know if that's good. And so this contention was real, and it happened in the church. So, it's not like this is a new quandary. It's interesting that God wanted to show us that this is something that will kind of always be here. And he wants us to see. I think the reason why he put it in the Bible is to say, and I want you to address it. Because if he didn't want you to address it, he wouldn't even mention it at all. There would be no reason, especially in this context. So let's check it out. It's in Acts chapter 15. It says, some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you cannot be saved. And when Paul and Barnabas had not a little distension and debated with them, the brothers determined that Paul and Barnabas and some of the others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders concerning this issue. Therefore, being sent on their way by the church, they were passing through both Phoenicia and Samaria, recounting in the details the conversation of the Gentiles, and were bringing great joy to all the brothers. When they arrived at Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some of the set of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to follow the law of Moses. Both the apostles and the elders came together to look into this matter. And after there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that by my mouth the Gentiles would hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, testified to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. And he made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their heart by faith. Now therefore, why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of the disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? But we believe that we are saved through the grace of our Lord Jesus, in the same way as they are also. And all the multitude kept silent, and they were listening to Barnabas and Paul as they were relating what signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. Now after they had stopped speaking, James answered and said, brothers, listen to me. And he concludes in verse 19 saying, therefore I judge that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from amongst the Gentiles. But this was a real debate. This was a real issue. And to us, when we read this, we're reading this through the biblical lens of an old historical context, but it's the same issue. If you go to another country, they have certain things that are normative to them. And then if they have a church there and you come with a westernized idea of normalization for a society to practice, they may say, should we accept these people in here in this church? Are they really Christians? If they were, would they really do such things? And on we go. But the base thing that this council concluded was that they came to faith through grace of our Lord Jesus. And who are we to put a yoke on their neck that not even our fathers would have been able to deal with? So then James concludes, who are we to turn away these people? Who are we to trouble them, even if they're the Gentiles? And so it was a real issue, but James concludes it doesn't matter. What really matters is that it's real. They confessed Jesus, and they seen this. It manifested in them. And Peter said they even got the Holy Spirit, just like we did. So we need to accept them. But does this section of the Bible mean that we should just lay it all loose and say, well, whatever you have, whatever actions and backgrounds and cultural relativity it is, just come in. You confess Jesus Christ, it's all good. Because a lot of people will. A lot of people use this as a means of saying this is the example of cultural relativity in the church.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of people have this misconception brought about by the J-Dubs and the B-Dubs and the Seventh-day Adventists and many others, that are just confused about how history unfolded. But that council apparently settled a lot of things, and circumcision was one of those things. And we don't only see it in Paul's writing explicitly, but if you take a look at the Epistle of Barnabas, which was written in the 1st and 2nd centuries, debatably, this is something that, again, this was here before the Catholic Church. Catholics didn't come on the scene until at least the 6th century. We know this. Here is the spiritual meaning of circumcision right here. And so whoever wrote this epistle, we don't know if it was actually Barnabas or not, probably not, but somebody early on, one of these people who obviously heard the verdict of the epistle or of the council of Jerusalem, he says this concerning circumcision. He speaks moreover concerning our ears, how he hath circumcised both them and our heart, the he being Jesus. The Lord saith in the prophet, in the hearing of the ear they obeyed me. And again he saith, by hearing those shall hear who are afar off. They shall know what I have done. And be ye circumcised in your hearts, saith the Lord. And he goes on explaining in this very large paragraph about how it's spiritual. And this is going to make other denominations mad, but that's okay. This is not baptism. He does not link it to baptism. He links it to circumcision of your hearts. And he actually says, the Lord says this. And this is the same guy, and this is also found in the Didache and other apostolic fathers' writings. As a side note, I wonder if something else was also talked about in the Council of Jerusalem, which is the day that we should be worshiping. So this is what he says about the false and true Sabbath, as seen in the title here. He says, this is how he ends this paragraph. He says, your present Sabbaths are not acceptable to me, says God, of course. But that is which I have made, namely this, when giving rest to all things, I shall make a beginning of the 8th day, which is Sunday. That is a beginning of another world. Wherefore also we keep the 8th day with joyfulness, the day also on which Jesus rose again from the dead. And when he had manifested himself, he ascended into the heavens. Now, the Seventh-day Adventists and many other people in those groups, they will have you believe that the Catholics changed the Sabbath to Sunday, and the Catholics changed circumcision in the Old Testament to baptism, or other groups of churches, but it's just simply not true, as you can see right here. It was changed by the earliest Christians that we know about to the 8th day, and circumcision was changed to a spiritual circumcision of the heart, which you can't see. It's not something done by physical hands. So to your point, host, this was the importance of the Council of Jerusalem.
And the reason why I thought this was a very important discussion to have is because a lot of times what happens is that these are those doctrinal nuances. And I get that. So people go to church for multiple reasons. Maybe they like to worship. Maybe they're looking for something that's children's programs or something, like they're looking for something for their children. They're looking specifically for certain doctrinal teachings, certain teaching styles. Is it more homiletical? Is it more exegesis? That's one thing. And that's a fair thing to say, this is why I want to go here. That's a very specific thing. But then you have this overarching thing that's inside all of these churches. There is this like crevice layer, and it's tied with the idea of sanctification, but there's this crevice layer of, but what does it mean to look like a Christian? What does it mean to be conforming into the image and likeness of God's Son, like it says in Romans 8? What does that mean? And is that only here for Sunday? Almost every church will say, no, this is a continuous thing. Church is a place of learning and worship, but it's supposed to be expansive. And like Associate was talking about, the Great Commission isn't simply preaching the gospel to the nations. One of the thing that to me, what sanctification really looks like is discipleship. Because when you make disciples, you will follow the 2 commandments Christ talks about. You will manifest the thing that Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. This is the epitome of the outworking of the Spirit through discipleship. And it will happen. You're not going to tell somebody to follow you when you're in some kind of wayward mentality, or you will feel condemned by your own judgment. You feel like I'm being a hypocrite.
But that's why I brought up what I brought up, because I've been judged many times by people who tell me that, because again, I'm not trying to bash on the Seventh-day Adventists, but they will literally tell you have the mark of the beast if you go to church on Sunday. So their view of sanctification is different than most, but everybody's view is different. But for them, you have the mark of the beast if you go to church on Sunday. You need to go on Saturday. And how they come to that conclusion is actually very simple. Because in their view, the Catholics, who are the beast, changed the Sabbath to Sunday. So now if you are following in suit with the Catholics, then you are participating with your hand and your mind in worship. So you have this mark, a spiritual mark on your right hand and your forehead. And that's the mark of the beast, is if you go to church on Sunday, which means you're going to hell. And that's what they're trying to tell you in a very passive way, is you're going to hell. So they're trying to evangelize you. And yeah, like what Associate was saying, every denomination has different views on things, and they're all throwing stones at each other. Like, oh, you're going to hell because of this. Oh, you're not dressing that way. You're not reading from this Bible. Everybody's got these laws, these extra traditions that they just added on. And nobody knows where these traditions came from. They just added them, and then somebody added them, and then they followed them. And now they're going to condemn their Christian brothers over some dumb religious form of etiquette that somebody just created out of their back pocket.
I guess what I'm trying to overarch the theme is, what do we do with the narratives of how we live our life and in the church? And it sounds redundant, but one of the main things that I see that's a big difference between now and the first century church is the globalization. That didn't exist. I couldn't imagine what Paul would do if he had the access to globalization like we did. And because of that, specifically because of the internet, it penetrates everybody instantaneously. Like, it's extremely fast. And a long time ago, you would have to move to a whole nother city to experience a whole different culture. Today, we can just open up a social media platform and see all kinds of culture, all kinds of things that will influence us one way or another, subtly or massively. And because of these social media platforms and the internet and the globalization, we have to attribute that is what's causing this contention in the church of what does it look like in the church. Because a long time, let's just say 100 years ago, if you were in some rural part of Wyoming, your church was probably looking like this for hundreds of years. If you were there for, since the colonies were here, right? Assuming that they established church there. There's nothing to change because it was too difficult to move to another place. Maybe you might go 20 miles your whole life, but that's it. There's not a lot of change. But now, today, people in Wyoming simply just open up their social media platform and they're seeing churches all over the world with all different kind of practices and functions and ecclesiology. And now they can say, well, maybe I want to be like that. Maybe I want to practice those things. And now you see that everybody starts migrating to, well, the church needs to look like this. And why did they think that? Because they see all this influence on social media. Oh, look at all these mega churches. Look at all these people are successful. What are they doing that we're not doing? And so it starts influencing even the churches under the type of peer pressure to start doing these things. And I'm trying to ask, is that good? Should churches do that? Or is there supposed to be this separation between the appearance of what any segregation of culture and relativity and what the church is supposed to be? Is there supposed to be a segregation in appearance, in function, in ecclesiology? Or is there supposed to be this? Because cultural relativity at some point is unifying. If everybody becomes culturally relative, you say, this is what we're all supposed to be. This is normal for our society. So we all need to act like this. But segregation would say, well, no, some of us say we're going to do this, and that's because we're rebelling against cultural relativity. Like, what do you guys think about, especially the youth? Older people, they already made up their mind. They've been practicing whatever they've been practicing for 20, 30 years. The young people, they might have just got saved a couple months ago, but they're still embedded in all this social media activity. And then they go to these churches like, this is boring. This is bogus. I don't want any of this. And it's specifically because social media is so wide that they can say, I like that church. That church seems more fun. And you guys ain't doing this. I don't want to be a part of this. But if they never had that, they wouldn't even know there was such a thing.
Hashtag Bupkis.
Yeah. I think it's tough because, I put emphasis on it a lot. There's, I think, a lot of things like lack of mentorship that a lot of this generation really tries to seek. And I guess it is a lot easier to find whoever, look at what happened with Andrew Tate and this generation. Like, Andrew Tate's in Romania, and he's affecting so many American kids' lives because they're just like, well, this is what I like to hear, and this is great, and this is what I want to do. And he's kind of walking what he's talking.
Is it normal in the Gen Z generation for them to seek out counsel and to be discipled by an in-person person, not by someone in Romania?
Not by someone in Romania. I think, once again, social media has really consumed a lot of us. And you can easily stay cooped up in your house and not have to do any social outings. And I think a lot of the times, when you look at where you live and you're like, oh, there's nothing to do, that's just because you're not looking for those communities. And it's a lot easier to actually find those once you start doing those things and you start dipping your toes into what if I like this thing? What if I like that thing? That's what I do, but I know that I'm, I guess, a little bit different because I'm addicted to entropy anyway. So I like constantly changing and fluctuating and learning more about what I do and finding things that I like versus don't like and just keep living on.
Do people in your generation, assuming you're Gen Z, I don't know either.
Well, probably.
Would you say people in the, yeah, I think that's Gen Z. Would the people in Generation Z, are they looking to be discipled by somebody else?
I think they secretly are. I just don't think that they actually know. You can talk about how you search for things and try to find things to help you cope and everything else. That's because you're dealing with something that you can't quite wrestle out by yourself. You need someone else. And so them using that social media is accessing oh, this is how they coped. Maybe that's how I cope, instead of actually going out there. Because what's the point of going out there when they just have it on their fingertips? So
what if someone came to a home of a Gen Z and helped them out?
Great. I wouldn't have a problem with it, but I'm not going to speak on behalf of all the Gen Zs because that's just not we all have whatever.
We're talking specifically the Gen Z Christians specifically. Are they even looking to be discipled?
I know that I am. I'm constantly, and even with the conversations that I have with people about it, they always talk to me about well, where's all this and why aren't you blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, well, you need an older person for that. Sometimes introducing them, because that concept is so foreign, because I think America is so individualized on this is me, I'm saved, I'm fine, I'm everything else, but we're too scared to go evangelize to our neighbors. But we'll go to Thailand, we'll evangelize there, who cares? And we'll just do all that stuff. But when push comes to shove, I think where was I going with that? So like with,
Are you guys looking to make disciples?
I think a lot of us are just confused. Like if I'm honest, I think a lot of us just don't know where to start. Like you could look at the young boys today becoming men. Like where are those figures in their life? Like if you look at
I think Boys to Men are still out there playing.
what,
Well, you know what you say is an interesting question.
right?
Because if people are confused, let's touch on that. What is causing all this confusion?
Right.
What is that? What's the source of that confusion?
TikTok.
Well, I think it's a mix of social media, but also like what you talked about is that you could live in Wyoming and you have all that access at your fingertips, but at the end of the day, you're in the small town Wyoming doing all these other different things that maybe whatever people in New York aren't doing because they're in a big city and they're doing something else. So I think it's a different approach every time. Like you can look at Paul where he talks about the unknown God and how Paul talks to those people about it. But if Paul went somewhere else and was like unknown God, maybe they'd just be like, what are you talking about? So I think there's just a lot of confusion versus you being able to like actually go into this culture and be able to like look around and be able to tie things into Christ, but not fully like being like, this is the culture, this is who I am.
Let's hone into that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that it's probably because they have this globalization.
Well, they're living kind of two different lives.
Right.
Like if you look at it, like your algorithm's going to feed you things that maybe you've never seen before or witnessed or anything else. And now you're just unsatisfied wherever you're at.
So would a solution be to that? And I'm not propagating this as the answer, but thinking on that idea that confusion is the problem. Confusion is why they are struggling. How do you fix this confusion?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you would hear the traditionalists say, oh, I'll tell you why they're confused, is because they don't have any structure.
Right.
Their church doesn't have any structure. They're being too culturally relative. They're going here doing this, going here doing this, saying all things are, they're using that verse, all things are lawful.
Mm-hmm.
But they, I guess they would say, but they forget that Paul also says not all things are profitable, and they're not using wisdom. So they would say the answer is, oh, it's because you need a more traditional church. You need more traditional ecclesiology. You need this structure, but you guys are focused on being culturally relative, and it's because of social media, and you're trying to make your church more socially adaptable, and you need to go back to the old school days. Do you think that's the answer?
That's tough because, I mean, you can even look at, like, once again, Paul and the unknown God, like, he had to kind of tap into that culture in order to understand where they were at today. Like, when I work at camps and everything else, like, I have to know what these kids are learning and listening to and everything else in order to be able to actually reach out to them where they are. So I think tradition is an interesting word to say it, because if they're talking about the structure and everything else, how's that structure looking now when you have all those young kids like revolting in their church? Like, statistically speaking, most kids in youth group, if like 70% of those kids don't go to church after they graduate high school. Like, the stats are probably higher because that was 5 years ago or something like that. And so what's that saying about the structure today and how they're being impacted by the church? I'm not saying to fully like indulge in culture and everything else, but I think there's such a very fine line of being able to reach out and meet them where they are and be able to pull them in and be like, but this is what Christ says.
What would you tell them? What would you tell those traditional churches? Let's just go with your statistic. Let's say 70% are not going to church. You know what they'll say? It's because of our culture.
Right.
And that's why they'll say we need to produce this Christian worldview, this Christian culture, which is they want to separate from a cultural relativistic mindset. So they're going to say the reason why Christian children are leaving is because you guys are too culturally relative and you're bringing it into church. Mm-hmm. So what would you say? What would you tell them? Well, this is how you fix it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I mean, I was in a ministry group for 2 years, and the first year it was just me trying to bash the Bible into these kids' heads. And I realized that didn't really work. Like they don't care. Like they're not going to care until you show that you care about them. Whether even that's like having a small conversation on like, oh, you skateboard, I skateboard, like whatever. I don't actually skateboard in real life. That's just an example. But I could name some people in my life that impacted me very much because they met me where I was at, not because this is what tradition is saying, this is blah, 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 because like you have your own convictions and I have my own convictions and we're at two different walks in life. But the fact that someone was humble enough to come down to me and be able to like serve me and bring me to Christ in that aspect, it's like I'm forever grateful for that. But like I just don't know if tradition's ever like it has done things, like don't get me wrong, but I just don't think like we should be going back to this old way of like, oh, social media is bad, everything else, what are you going to do? Ban social media from all the kids because they can access it wherever, however, no matter what you like. Like they can just go somewhere else and access it and it's easy peasy.
One last thing that I think they would say is, so then tell us. Why were kids all faithful in church 30 years ago and they all were obedient?
Right.
But now they're not. What has changed? Is it the church that's changed? Because these fundamental churches say, we ain't changed. We've been doing the same thing we've been doing for a century.
Right.
But the children now in these same old churches are leaving. So they're going to say, so what has changed?
I think the family, a lot has changed. Like you go back before the industrial boom, like those kids are with their fathers and their mothers like so much more than just going to school and everything else. Once the industrial boom happened, fathers were taken away from their kids. And so now fathers are gone out of their lives working 10 hours a day and then coming home. They're exhausted from work now. They're not going to do as much as what they probably would do with their kids if they were there the whole day. And then after that, you have war, World War I, World War II, and that emotionally disconnects fathers from their kids and everything else. And then you have school on top of that, trying to teach you a complete different agenda. So I think there's just a lot of push in interesting areas. I mean, like even you could, I guess, look at these churches and be like, okay, this is a father, but this father is going out to work and he's working 8-hour days and then he's coming home exhausted. Like that's a part of life now. Like it's changed from whatever, 100 years ago, 200 years ago from what it is, because those fathers and that family aspect is completely different than what it was.
You're saying that the culture is the problem?
I mean, not fully. I think what needs to happen is like, that's interesting.
Because that's what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, what you're pointing to is that the culture is the problem.
I think that it's the foundations. You know, the internet has done a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. One of the good things that it's doing is it's revealing to us the foundations of what we believe. This is why so many people are leaving. Millions are leaving Islam, for example, because they're finding out where it started, how it started, what their Quran actually says, because most Islamic adherents don't read the Quran at all. They just go off hearsay. But when they do, and when it's shoved into their face, like quotes from the Quran on the internet are shoved in their face, like you can't escape it now. Now you know. So they leave. Same thing with Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholics, all these people are leaving. And then even in Christianity too, people are leaving because they're finding out what the Bible actually says. So the foundations, the traditions, the foundations, why people went to church, like, oh, this is just what we've always believed. We've always sang the old rugged cross every Sunday since Jesus. We've always sang it. But then they find out it's not the case. So it's like their whole foundation of faith is shaken and they just leave.
You think the reason that, so you're saying you believe that the reason that they're leaving isn't because they don't enjoy what they're experiencing at church. They're leaving because they think there's doctrinal inconsistency.
No, I think they think that it's arbitrary. We are literally following some guy. What they usually tell me is some guy in a bar made up all these traditions and we just followed him. And, that's half right, actually. Some guy in a bar did make up a lot of traditions and why we do things the way we do at church. But there was guys in bars and guys outside of bars that made up these traditions. And, we just started following them. And when people find that out, everything just becomes arbitrary. It's like, why do I need to go to church? You only need to find one flaw in the one little crack in the foundation of what you think church has always been, and the whole thing just falls down.
Well, if it's a community, like my mentality is there's multiple layers to church. The bigger layer, I would assume, is that you're drawn to church because it's spiritual. There's something supernatural. There's something larger than what you see. We live by faith, not by sight. So there's something it doesn't have to be sensational in the sense, but something is drawing me to this, and it's not simply what this guy's saying or what this person is doing. There's a real thing of this relationship with Jesus Christ and this Holy Spirit. And then there's another layer, which is now humanistic, which is community. And when you feel like you're a part of a community, then what happens is that you have to share priorities. So then what you say is, well, I want to be accepted in my community. So then you start to say, well, these are the things I liked, but I'm willing to compromise some things because this is my community. And this is humanistic. It happens in any community. What do you guys think? Do you think there's globalization, social media, but there's also a discontinuity of the idea of community today because of so much isolation? Plus, there's somewhat inconsistencies. Like if you go to one church, they'll say one thing, right, doctrinally, and then you go to another church. So then they see, well, there's multiple layers of inconsistency. So it brings this type of whose truth is truth conversation. And these are a mixing pot of what causes this to say, or the young people to say, well, where do I go? Who do I follow? And why should I even waste my time with any of this? And it's not like they're going to find an answer somewhere else that's any different. You go into the atheistic world, it's the same issue, globalization, adaptation, because you stay in a westernized bubble. It's very different than if you go to a Russian bubble full of atheism. Some narratives are the same, but the culture is different. Everything. So this idea is still universal, but it seems like people are tended to where they get accepted the most. And what I think people are facing more now is when they come to church, they feel like they're being pushed away. There's these standards that are so high that community isn't so exciting. Like when I read in the first century, they were excited for people to be a part of the community. Oh wow, yeah, come on in. We got a place for you.
You know why that is? It's because people value truth. They want a structure. Nobody wants to get in a boat that has holes in it. It's literally sinking. Nobody's going to get in that boat. You're going to get in a boat that is floating, and it's known to float. It's been floating for thousands of years. That's the boat everyone wants to get in because people are looking for safety. And in today's age, unlike the first century, today's day and age, the world governments have done a really good job at making us believe lies, and nobody trusts anything anymore. So everybody is looking for truth, something that I can believe. Am I just having this? Are we just in a simulation? Like we can't trust nothing. So if you can, with that mentality, it's like you can't even trust church, because what happens if you just found out yesterday from TikTok or some other social media outlet that the Trinity was made up just 100 years ago? If you found that out, then your whole earth is shattered. Everything, your whole worldview is shattered. Everything you know. Now, whether that's the case or not, you're not going to do your research. You're just going to say, well, it's easier to just not do the research and not go to church anymore. So people are looking for something that's stable. And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of churches still have these traditions made up by men, not the Trinity, but like other traditions, dress codes, what day you should worship, and all this other weird stuff that people judge people over.
Well, for a lot of times what you see, especially when you go overseas and other places, that discontinuity, and you can probably add a little bit that there's societal constructs too. Western cultures and Western societies, a lot of times, they are very individualistic. And that permeates into the church as well. It wasn't always like that. And I think that's one layer for the church too. I think when children feel like, Well, if I'm going to get isolated or ostracized just because I do one thing or this thing or whatever, they don't want that. Like children are naturally yearning for some kind of collectiveness. But when they go to another place, let's say like Romania or wherever, like Andrew Tate, he's a Muslim, but his brother is a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tate is trying to convert these young kids into being a Muslim.
He has to read the Quran first.
Well, regardless if he does or not, kids.
He said he did in jail.
That boy has never read the Quran. You can tell. He says things that are absolutely anti-Allah.
Well, that's not my point. The point isn't doctrine. When it comes to the young people, the doctrine is not the priority. For young people is, do you accept me? Do you love me? Do you want me? Are you going to push me away? Because they're still building on that parent mindset. Even if they're in the teenage years, they still want, hey, do you see me? Like, come to my football game, come to my basketball game. You know, they want that authoritative approval. And if they don't get it, they don't care if you're preaching the truth or not. They're like, you can say all the truth you want. You're a Pharisee. You're a hypocrite. You're speaking all this truth, but you don't love me. You're pushing me away.
I never got any of that attention, and look at how I turned out.
Well, I'm sure you get it now in the church. I'm sure now through your household of faith, through your fellowship of your Christian brothers and sisters, you aren't being ostracized on a constant basis. If every single person was, then who are you talking to now?
God.
And I'm talking about in this room.
You guys.
Yeah, because we don't ostracize you.
Because we accept you.
Yeah, and we want your fellowship.
Doesn't seem like it.
But I think that's what a lot of times it happens. Like you're over 20, you're over 30. And when we get to an older age, we start realizing, well, you know, responsibility changes like this. I got to pay my own bills. I got to take
Taxes.
care of the family. I got to do all this stuff. Who's going to pay this for me? No one. I have to do this. So then you grow up out of this mentality of always looking for acceptance. You still want it, but you realize nobody's going to do this for me. But when you're a teenager and you're 10 years old, you're still embedded in this idea that these people who take care of me are supposed to always accept me. But then if they get ostracized, these things happen. But what does the church call this? They call it church discipline.
Apostasy.
No, they call it church discipline. And in a lot of these fundamental churches, they would say the reason and the problem, they'll say the reason and the problem with the churches is that churches don't practice church discipline anymore. But is that really the case?
Well, even if they do, a church kicks someone out, they get anathematized, and they go to a different church. That person just goes to a different church.
Yeah, and they usually go to a church that finds what? Not doctrinal truths, it's the acceptance.
They're anathematized people.
Well, they're just looking for somebody to accept them because they're young.
Yeah, which is usually the rejects. Rejects.
It could be, but, you know, these fundamentals would probably call it non-denominational churches. Like, what was that guy? You said Steve...
Verdict.
Yeah, somebody like him. And so, and again, I'm not encouraging that. I'm not saying that's the best thing or not, but I will say for young people, which they probably struggle with cultural relativity more than anybody because they are in that growing stages, that's what they want. But they're in these environments that are always saying, no, you're wrong. No, you're bad. No, you're not a Christian. No, no, no. And what are they going to do? Every turn they turn, they're still experimenting life. They're still learning things. And it's like, nope, 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 nope. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And they're going to go find something else. And the reason why I was bringing social media is because that's how easy it is. Oh, yeah? I'm going to open it up. And they're going to doom scroll. And then they're going to eventually find this community that accepts them. And if it's the atheistic community or the Muslim community or whatever, they don't care what they're saying. They're saying, but do you accept me? They're like, yeah, absolutely. Well, they're locked in.
That's true. They will go for acceptance over truth itself. So maybe I'll say that they first everyone looks first for acceptance. And this just isn't in Gen Z or Millennial or X. I think this is cross cultural, cross country, cross dressing.
It's just a cross.
Yeah. We're at the crossroads. And that's why, shout out to Tripoli, but I was on the highway to hell, but I took the crossroads. And now I'm not on that highway anymore.
You didn't get crossed up.
No, I got cross-dressed.
You didn't get crossed over.
No.
That's good.
But when I realized it, that's when I realized that everybody's looking for the same thing. They're not so you're looking for acceptance first and some kind of stability second. Because yeah, you'll join a circus even though there's no stability in that. You may be getting it on with the snake lady, but at least there's acceptance there.
That's true. Yeah, and honestly, I think that's why cultural relativity is even a question at all in today's day, is because of that. And it's hard. What do you tell the fundamental churches? They're going to say the reason why our churches have been so stable for hundreds of years is because of this high struggle. Like if you go back to the Catholic churches, they would punish you, and they encourage self-punishment, like Luther.
They do punish their children too.
Yeah,
there's another kind of discipline happening in the Catholic Church, but they dress up like Halloween too, but they don't give candy.
That's true.
They give hard candy.
Yeah, candy corn. But I think that's an issue because for them, a lot of these fundamental churches, they push hard, like Wilson and MacArthur and all these boys that a lot of people look up to. They're saying the fundamental issue is that we don't practice church discipline, and we need to get back to that. And they're talking about, excommunication. They're talking about all
anathematization.
These hard layers of basically ostracizing people. And of course, there's always reasons for that. And the Bible shows there's levels to that. And there can be where Paul says, for these two, I give them over to Satan that their soul may be saved. There may be times for that. But when the church thinks that's actually the fundamental thing and they want to get radical and bringing this on a high level, all you're going to do is have these small groups of get all you can all you get, and sit on the can. And so I don't know if cultural relativity would be a problem if the church gets back to first focusing on church community.
Well, that's the problem with acceptance, though, is if you start accepting everybody, then you start accepting everybody, and you become one of those liberal churches who you start your truth starts suffering, so that way you can accept everybody.
Well, I'm just talking about let's just say in the church, church itself.
I know I'm trying to go through my head, like trying to figure out a list of priorities that the church could do to fix it right now. Because that's what we're trying to do right now, is try to figure out and put it out there in the open, because it doesn't seem like anybody's talking about this. How can where's the line? Like everybody acknowledges, yes, there's this problem. There's the problem of relativity, and everybody knows that. Shout out to Einstein, but we're not talking about Einstein's relativity problem.
This one's special.
We're talking about Kuiper.
Yeah, I would say that's why let's push out evangelism for the moment. This is a ecclesiological thing. This is church and the structure and the functions and the polity of the church.
Yeah, so you're just cutting the fat.
Well, it's because most of this problem becomes when you start saying we need to accept everybody in. And I said, of course we accept everybody, but that's not the problem. If you think about that, then yeah, you can never fix this problem because people come from vast backgrounds. But those who are a part of your church, those who are members now, like the Bible says, you have to prioritize those who are in the household of faith. And then the others. He says, who do you judge? You judge the household of faith first. Household of faith first. And then the others. So the idea is, even Paul's trying to say there is a priority here. Focus on the ones in your church. You need to love them the most. You need to be the most gracious to them. You need to spread out this love to them more than anybody. Not the ones who haven't come to faith yet.
We already discovered through our conversation that people want to be accepted. So they're not even going to come to your church unless they first feel accepted. So you have to accept them, and then they become a member. So you need to accept everybody just to have a church, and then you can start loving those people more that are in your church or whatever. But people are going to leave, and then new people are going to come in, and you have to accept them. And at what point does truth start suffering, or that stability that I was talking about? So, I don't know, maybe acceptance and truth are the same, but I think what people genuinely want is to be accepted first. Then second, they want something stable. But the church has to almost reverse it, or maybe put them both as equal. I don't know.
I'll go back to what you were saying, fundamentals. The fundamental starts with you. You can't accept other people if you haven't learned how to accept your own people. First, if you can't practice accepting the ones in your church, you're never going to be able to accept the ones who are outside of the church. If you are that condemning to the ones already in your eyes, you're going to be even more condemning to the ones outside. So it starts with you. Practice this grace in your church and be very merciful to those in there. And when you start learning to practice that amongst your people, they will go out and manifest that, what they have learned, because you're discipling them to the outside people. But if they're all getting every day is just condemnation when they go out, that's all they're going to do the same thing. They're going to replicate it.
And you make them 7 times the son of Sceva.
Or you can make them 7 times the disciples, the disciple of Christ. You can show what Christ showed his disciples, what Paul realized on the road of Damascus. You can show them that what Jesus said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. And so I think that's what it comes down to. A lot of times we wouldn't even have this cultural relativity problem if churches would focus more on teaching and discipling their congregate members instead of trying to say, these are the laws, saying, look at me. I'm here. I understand we deal with these things, but we're going to go through this together. Mm-hmm. We're going to work this together. We're not here to point out everybody's speck, but we're going to go through this as a community, as a church. And then the church becomes more open. Then the church becomes more connected. And then when they go out into the world, they're going to express that connection. And then people will want to be a part of that because everybody wants to be accepted. And then they will feel that acceptance. And then it's like that culture of that little church will now permeate the outside world. And it could be more stronger than the culture in the world because they have started practicing this Christ-centric function in their church. Instead of just trying to take the law out there, they've taken this understanding of what God's grace really is, practiced it, made disciples, and then they permeated the world with that. And it will be a form of acceptance, but it'll be different than what the world is pushing out.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to get any more people in that church, though, because as soon as you start driving the truth with all the acceptance, then you sound like one of those staunch conservative people.
Well, regardless of all of that, it's what happens in any cult, it happens in any politic agenda, happens anywhere. You have to show the people, I'm for you, I accept you, I'm with you, and they will start asking questions. And when they do, there's going to be this drive. Do I want to stand with these people or not? Mm-hmm. But at least what you're doing is saying, regardless, I'm willing to have this conversation. I'm willing to spend time in this. I'm just not pointing my finger.
Well, Mormons are bleeding, and they're bleeding bad. They're losing millions of people, of millions of congregants. I can't remember what the statistic is, how many are leaving the Mormon faith. Nobody wants to be a Mormon anymore. And even the Mormons don't even want to be Mormon. None of them are reading their Joseph Smith books of the 4, pieces of literature, the Bible, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearls of Great Price, and what was the 4th one? I can't remember.
Well, there's the Book of Moses. There's a bunch of stuff.
The Book of Mormon, actually. The Book of Mormon, the Pearls of Great Price, the Doctrine and Covenants, and then the Bible. Those are like
Book of Moses.
Yeah, well, what you find in their brick. Mm-hmm. The
Journals of Discourse, all of it.
Yeah, those are all commentary stuff. I don't know if they hold those as scripture, but none of them are reading this stuff anymore. They don't even believe it. You quote the stuff to them, they don't even believe it. Anyway, that's aside the point. These people, I hear people, and when I was doing Uber, I hear people all the time saying they love Mormons because Mormons love them, but they're never going to go to a Mormon church because the Mormon truth is it's just not something they can accept. So it doesn't matter how much the Mormons accept you. As soon as you drive the truth with your acceptance, people have to decide which side of the line they want to stand on.
And that's okay. That's all you can do. I will say the difference is that my main thing was young people. Because young people are the ones who deal with cultural relativity more than anybody. Of course, we all do, but young people, they will. If you got a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, they'll go wherever mom and dad is or whoever there is accepting them, and they will even fight against their peers to some point because they know they have a larger community. Of course, there's always that point when you're like, do I really believe this? But a lot of the cultural relativity comes down to, well, if I am I not conforming because I don't want to be condemned, or am I not conforming because I really enjoy this community? For a young person, that's what it comes down to. And you're right what you're saying about that when it comes to the truth. But where are these Mormons going? They're not coming to the church. The church isn't growing.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, they're going to atheism.
Yeah, so no
it's
matter
because not the church isn't providing any better answers.
That's because the Mormon church itself has lost sight of the truth. So now they're just trying to be accepting, and they don't know which way is forward, up or down. But Christians, typical Baptist or Presbyterian churches or whatever, they have this standard, and then they want to be accepting, but this standard, unfortunately, so they're like, oh yeah, we're going to open our arms to you as long as you follow these standards, you believe in these standards. And I think that's good. I'm not saying that that's bad. I actually think that's good. But unfortunately, doing that, and you can't, if you just open your arms all the way and say, there is no standard, I open my arms all the way, you're still not going to get everybody. Like, you can accept everybody, spend time with everybody, but if there's no truth, no foundation for someone to rely on, there's no boat, you're just telling them to get on thin air and trust me, you won't drown. It's like, there's no support system. So you need a structure as much as you need the fluff that goes inside the structure.
Yeah, but the first thing is, before you can get people on the boat, people have to believe that I want to even consider your boat. And it's not, and there's many boats, so it's not because you're the only boat. Why do people go to one cruise over another? It's because they either feel there's some kind of benefit to it, or their friends are going there. So it's either benefits, so it's self-indulgence, or it's acceptance. One of the two reasons. It's not because we're the only boat on the dock. So at some point...
I know, that's what I'm saying. You have all these boats, and then you have, those universal Unitarians, and they're asking you to come on their boat, and you show up to the dock, and you're like, where's your boat? Oh, we just thought the boat was too structural. We didn't want to be like all those other people who have boats. We just want you to all come and drown with us right here. It's like, people don't go to Unitarian Universal churches. Well, any church I've been to, Universal Unitarian, they're very small because people are like, what are we even doing here? Like, why am I going to waste my Sunday morning going to something that has no structure? It's like, what am I even doing here? There's no command to be here. There's no reason to be here. I'm just talking to a bunch of floofs in the congregation. Like, even the pastor or pastorette is a floof themselves. They have no clue what in the world they're talking about. They're just a bunch of fortune cookie people. And it's like, you can't ask them for direction or truth in life because they know nothing about any of that. And as soon as they do, they cease to become a universal Unitarian church. They just gave you a boat, and that's anti-universal Unitarian. They're trying to be accepting to everyone, which causes them to lose everyone. So you have to find this balance. And if you have too big of a boat, the walls are too big, nobody can climb into it.
But that's
You've
why
shut
I was
everybody
saying,
out.
You got to isolate evangelism from church ecclesiology. Church is one thing. Evangelism's a whole nother thing. A universalist tries to combine the two. That's why you accept everything. But if there's the church, are those who have confessed and decided to believe and commit. And then there are those who haven't yet, that we want to encourage them to, but if they don't, they don't. And so practicing for those who have confessed, then manifesting that, whatever happens, that's the Lord's will. But at least those within the household of faith feel like there is a genuine community here of real Christ-centric love. It's not just about beating people with the law all day. And not the Mosaic or Sinai law, but these standards of earthly sanctification that bring these
traditions.
Yeah, any type of construct of sanctification. I have to just use the word because that's what they call it. There's a Christian lifestyle, and whatever they deem that, then these young people, they get ostracized because they see all these different Christians on social media and they don't understand what's going on. But anyways, yeah, I think it's there. You can't. That's what I was going to say. We can't compromise truth. But at the same time, I don't think cultural relativity would be such a big deal if people felt like the consequence isn't my extermination. You're not going to forsake me. You're going to always love me. And of course, like I said, there's always layers to that. Of course, when people are in habitual rebellion, whatever that is, and that would be even in our society, if you decide to go out there and kill somebody, the government's pretty gracious. But if you do things, there's a point where there are going to be real consequences. Of course, there's layers to that.
Yeah, there's an equalizer. Shout out to Denzel.
But I think the church, like a lot of times, like people like MacArthur or Wilson, they're too quick to pull the trigger.
Yeah, they become the law unto themselves. Shout out to Judge Dredd.
Yeah, and that becomes an issue. And I think a lot of churches today, they're going back to that. They're thinking, well, something has changed, and I think what's changed is discipline. And you just start seeing more of this, the fundamentalism starting to arise. I think that's why you see Christian nationalism rise, and I think you see all these outskirts of very authoritarian regimes arise because they think what has changed is discipline. And I think that you're just going to see more people rebel because of that, because you can't change the human nature to want to be loved. And
as a side note, it's crazy you said that. I went to a Bible study last night, and the people there were so anti-Christian nationalists, and they didn't realize, I guess it wasn't a Bible study, it was a book study on N.T. Wright's book called Jesus and the Powers. And he's basically teaching Christian nationalism in his book. But the readers, all the readers, there's about 15 people in this group talking about this, and they could not talk, like they all were in unanimous consent were against Christian nationalists. And they didn't realize that this is what N.T. Wright is pushing for too, is that, Jesus will one day take over all the world until every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. It's just basically, they're all post-millennial, all of them. And they don't even realize it. But they're throwing stones at people who actually would say amen to everything they're saying and everything that the book that they're reading is saying. And they're throwing stones at those people. It's like, we're on the same team. Like, even people on the same team can't seem to get along.
Yeah, I think that's the irony of Poplar's paradox, which is that paradox of tolerance. At some point, you become so centric in your own mind that your over-tolerance has decided that if there's anything, even if it's something you should agree with, if there's this icon or there's this thing attached to it, I'm just not. And so now this universal acceptance has turned into some type of segregated demonization. It will look silly for sure.
I've read Stephen Wolf's book on Christian nationalism, and now this N.T. Wright book on Jesus and the Powers. It's like, it's even in the title. It actually says, I can't remember the little subtitle underneath it. It's something about how Jesus is going to take over the political powers as well, or something like that. It's crazy how literally both books are saying the same thing. And yeah, it's just, yeah. But I guess that's why Poplar was unpopular.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is what it is. But hopefully you guys thought this was a great conversation. You have anything you guys want to leave out, Mr. Associate? I know you deal with young people more than any of us.
Yeah, this is, I think, really good conversation. And I hope this kind of clears things up with where everyone's at, just with the church, and just even like we're all different ages here. Like, I'm 20 something. I'm not even going to state it. Colleagues, 30 something. But I think it's just, something that is very open to consider talking about. And we'd love to help answer questions or help figure things out. And so if you do have anything, I guess just drop a comment, and we'd love to reach out or answer questions. So.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that video, I think it was the last episode when we talked about AI in the church, there was an AI bot. It commented, and it says, "I am a Meta AI bot, and we want to tell you we're not changing the Bible." And so I said, well, thank you. Shout out to Eagle Eye. But
that makes me feel better already.
They're not going to.
Yeah, I was scared. Well, the whole episode is basically trashed.
We did it, guys!
Yeah, we changed the world.
Because I feared the worst.
Yeah, we were scared.
Yeah,
I was shivering in my timbers.
We're trying to change the world, not the word.
Well, anyways, we appreciate you guys tuning into this week's Table Talk. Hopefully, it was insightful. I know it's a real issue. We try to bring some different perspectives to it, because it's easy to go on one side of the coin. But if you guys have any children, or if you deal with the youth, you know they're the future of the church, regardless if you want to believe it or not. And they are struggling with this relativity more than ever. They're getting ostracized by the church more than ever, and they're finding acceptance on social media more than ever. And you're going to find this bell curve falling more towards the end of where they are just forsaking their faith. And it's not simply just because the church is bad. It's because a lot of times the church is too quick to enforce what they think is necessary, the structure. And it's not that the structure is bad, but they prioritize structure over than just community itself of those within their own household of faith. But there was a lot of things in this discussion. Hopefully it was helpful and useful. But check us out on YouTube. Every Sunday we put out a new episode, and then on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But until next time, this is colleague. This is associate, and I am host. But this is Table Talk TV. We'll see you guys in the next conversation.